Yeah, so we are live.
You can pause the link.
Hi guys, happy Independence Day. So today we are back with another important session with Dr. Kiran Pedi with a discussion on IBD. He is a senior gastroenterologist in Citizens Hospital and he has his own personal clinic named Gastro International in Hyderabad. He also has a fellowship in advanced endoscopy and he has done IBD, he has work experience on IBD from Australia. So, welcome, doctor.
Thank you,
Uh,
Suparna.
yes, can you please say a brief introduction, like a short introduction on what IBD is and what are its symptoms?
Sure. First of all, I would like to thank you, Suparna, and Nikhil, and all the entire team for bringing this awareness session. I'm sure people find it very useful, and I must congratulate on your excellent initiatives, what you're undertaking, because there are a lot of sufferers in India, and I'm sure a lot of IBD patients would get benefited with your activities. So to start with, IBD stands for inflammatory bowel disease, and it mainly includes two types of conditions. One is ulcerative colitis, second is Crohn's disease. So ulcerative colitis is a condition where the entire large intestine gets affected, whereas in Crohn's disease, any part of the digestive tract can get affected, i.e. starting from mouth, food pipe, esophagus, or stomach, small intestine, large intestine. Any part can be affected. And you can call these two conditions as twins. So some people may get Crohn's and some people may get ulcerative colitis. And why people get that, there is no single answer, but multiple factors are proposed. For example, environmental factors. It is commonly seen in people who do transatlantic migration. That means people who go to US, UK and come back, or they stay there. So it's called transatlantic migration is one of the risk factors. And inappropriate immunity. What I mean to say that is an inappropriate immune response to normal microorganisms. Our intestines are full of microorganisms, and one has to mount appropriate fight against it. Say, for example, if you don't fight with the organisms, and if you mount excess immune response or subdued immune response. So these two are also supposed to cause inflammatory bowel disease. Apart from this, there are certain genetic factors are also proposed. In a single family, if both parents are affected, there is a high chance children can get IBD. And in fact, when I said twins, what I mean to say is within the same family, sometimes you come across somebody getting Crohn's disease and other person getting ulcerative colitis. So anything is possible. So on the whole, it's combination of genetic factors, environmental factors, dietary factors like westernized diet, and the immune responses. So all put together will cause IBD in a particular given person.
So diagnosis of IBD takes a very long time and there are a lot of misdiagnoses in the years. So why is that and how can it be reduced?
You tell me your first question again, Suparna.
I said diagnosis of IBD takes a very long time and in this years misdiagnosis happens a lot of time. So why is that? Correct. And how can it be reduced?
Yeah, there are two parts to the question. I'll talk about why it takes long time. So why it takes long time is, if you look at how IBD is diagnosed, whenever somebody gets symptoms, what are the symptoms of IBD? Somebody with getting ulcerative colitis, the common symptoms are diarrhea or bloody diarrhea, blood in the motion, abdominal pain. And if you look at Crohn's disease, some of these patients can get abdominal pain, diarrhea, vomitings, and lots of other things. If it affects children, children can show growth retardation. So if you look at these features, the clinical features, they are not super special features. People with simple antibiotic, simple infection, amoebiasis and other infections can also get these kind of symptoms. So one needs to have very high index of suspicion when you go for consultation to say, okay, this patient may be having IBD. Whereas in India, a lot of infections are seen in the community. Viral infections, bacterial infections, fungal infections. So many of the infections can cause tummy upset. It's basically presents like a tummy upset initially. Diarrhea, bloody diarrhea and other things. So it's a very high chance people or even doctors, the common physicians can think it may be simple infection like amoebiasis and other things. So what tends to happen? Patient gets antibiotic course and sent home. The episode gets slightly better and patient is happy. And then 1 month later, again he may get another episode. The again goes to the doctor, he may say chronic amoebiasis or chronic infections. Then gets another course of antibiotics and gets better. So like this, there are people who wasted or lost their time. Couple of years is lost. So there is a significant delay in the diagnosis. So why this is happening? That is because in India, IBD is thought to be extremely rare. 10-20 years ago, we used to think that IBD would never exist in India, but that's no more the case now. So the delay in the diagnosis is because of, number one, lack of suspicion or lack of awareness among the patients, and also, with all due respect, lack of awareness among the common general physicians and general surgeons, because it's a very specialized area of gastrointestinal diseases, and lots of the times the general physicians and general surgeon might think it's a simple infection and get treated accordingly. So lack of awareness among patients and lack of suspicion among general physicians and general surgeons is a main reason for delay in diagnosis. So like this, years can pass by, the patient is not getting better, the general physician, general surgeon tends to refer these patients to gastroenterologist, where the IBD is suspected and investigated and diagnosed. So by this time, 2 or 3 years can be lost as well. I've seen patients suffering for 10 years, and 10 years later the diagnosis happened. So there's a huge delay. That's one part of your question. Coming to second part of your question, why there is misdiagnosis. So again, when you go with these symptoms, as I said, these symptoms are not unique. For example, if you got rheumatoid arthritis, the joints can be deformed. So everybody can see them. If you can see, look at your hands. Hands are not normal. The joints can be deformed. Well, you can say this is not normal. There may be rheumatoid arthritis. So whereas IBD is not like that. IBD presents with abdominal symptoms, tummy upset, where it can happen with many other infections. So a lot of overlap of symptoms are there. So one needs to have very high index of suspicion when you're diagnosing IBD, because it is not seen. Unless you do a colonoscopy or a CT scan, the damage is not visible. Damage is not visible outside. And it can be misinterpreted as infections and all. So that is why it is misdiagnosed most of the times. And the diagnosis itself has got multiple components to it. So starting with the clinical features, then goes on to investigations like colonoscopy, endoscopy or CT scan or biopsy and some other blood test. So all this put together, then we can conclude it as an IBD. And anything not fitting, they say, well, it may not be IBD, it may be something else. Here, the commonest misinterpretation or commonest misdiagnosis with IBD is tuberculosis in our country. Because India is full of tuberculosis, lots of the times, the Crohn's especially, not ulcerative colitis, Crohn's is misdiagnosed as tuberculosis, and tuberculosis is also misdiagnosed as Crohn's disease. Whatever the test you do, we can't be 100% sure to say that this is Crohn's or this is IBD. I often tell my patients that despite doing all the tests, we can only say this is maybe about 70% chance of being Crohn's or 30% chance of being TB, or 60% Crohn's, 40% TB, or 60% TB and 40% maybe Crohn's disease. So whatever the test you do, you can't be 100% sure to say that it is not TB or it is not Crohn's disease. So a lot of overlap is there. That is another reason why it gets misdiagnosed. Apart from the normal infections, TB also plays a great role in misdiagnosis of this IBD condition.
So when symptoms happen, how can we reduce it, the number of years? Because it takes for the patient to go to a doctor, and unless a patient goes, we cannot say our symptoms. So when should a patient or any person who is just newly facing the symptoms should go?
First of all, common people also should know, like everybody knows heart attack. When they get chest pain, everybody knows that, am I getting heart attack and all. So that kind of awareness should be spreading into the public to say that an IBD is a chronic condition, and anybody is suffering from loose motions or blood in the motions on a repeated number of times. Once in a while, anybody can get it, but somebody is suffering from that on a repeated number of times. People should be aware that this is not a normal infection. Maybe I'm suffering from IBD. It needs investigation. This commonly you see in families. For example, somebody in the family has got ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. Somebody else in the family gets symptoms. The family gets alarmed to say that, well, my son or my daughter has got IBD, and they go and get investigated. Whereas common man, a normal person outside, may not be suspecting IBD. So this awareness should be coming in public in a big way. Then only the early approach to diagnosis, early start of the treatment will happen.
Doctor, is still IBD rare in India?
Very good question, Supriya, because as I said, about 20 years ago, we used to think that IBD is a disease of the Western world. IBD would never exist in India. That's what the conception was. But actually, if you look at the emergence of IBD, the incidence of disease, that means the number of cases recorded, new cases recording. I mean, whenever now you say cases being recorded, everybody thinks about COVID. But we are talking about IBD here. The number of new cases of IBD happening every year in India, if you map across the world, now India is rated as the highest incidence among other countries in India. So it is considered as the disease or emerging disease of developing countries. So there is a lot of emphasis on early diagnosis and treatment in IBD nowadays. So it is no more a rare condition. It is very much is there, and the incidence is rapidly increasing in India.
After getting diagnosed, what is the level of knowledge that a patient has about this condition?
That's another very big problem in India. A lot of the times what happens is, this is a condition which requires a lot of patience from patient side and a lot of patience from doctor side also. So what happens is, when the patient goes to doctor, and I mean, many a time doctors are very busy and they don't have time to explain the condition in detail, and they diagnose correctly, but the counseling is not happening on an appropriate basis. This is where patient lacks knowledge. Patient doesn't know how to take care of his condition and ends up in problem most of the time. So this requires a thorough explanation by doctor to the patient, and initially and also on a regular basis. So if you look at Western countries, because the disease is well established in Western countries, there are IBD counselors, means there are nurses or paramedic people who are trained in IBD. They are first port of contact to patients. They explain the condition, and any patient suffering on an on and off basis, the first port of contact is the IBD counselors, because doctors can be hard to get hold of. So IBD counselors play a great role. And in India, there are certain pharma companies who came up with this idea of IBD counselors. So the concept is gaining momentum, but still the knowledge, patient knowledge is still minimal. So what should be happening is, at the time of diagnosis, doctor should sit with the patient for 15 minutes, explain the condition in detail, and what is the disease, what is expected out of this, and what are the treatment options available, what are the precautions to be taken, and how to avoid them, how to avoid complications. All these need to be explained in detail. Then once a patient understands, so this can be normal, the acceptance rates of the disease will be better, and patient comfort will be better, and the treatment will be more useful.
So, like after diagnosed with IBD, what are the allied health conditions that come with IBD?
IBD can be a multi-system disease, and again, previously we used to think that IBD affects only intestines, but now there is a component called extra-intestinal manifestations of IBD. So what happens is, IBD can affect eyes, can affect bones, can affect joints, can affect skin, can affect liver, and lots of other tissues. Some rare instances it can affect other organs in the body also. So IBD should be treated as a multi-system disease, where monitoring should be done on a regular basis. And during monitoring, everybody should pay attention to eyes, skin disease, any other complications are happening, any liver complications are happening. All these need to be taken into consideration. And sometimes IBD can be a risk factor for malignancy, means cancers. Intestinal cancers can arise because of IBD. Anybody with chronic inflammation Means what happens in IBD, the intestines are getting inflamed over many years. So any inflammation happening on a long-term basis can be a risk factor for cancer development. So cancer can also be a complication of IBD. So that is the reason people should be under careful and regular observation, monitor these symptoms closely.
So this monitoring, as you said, so how much time gap should be given from one monitoring to the next? Means with 6 months or 1 year, after that again the test should be done. What is the correct and safest timing gap?
Yeah, there is no single rule, Suparna. So what happens is it varies from patient to patient. So in our unit, we came up with a model called KP3P model, where we starts with knowing the patient. KP stands for knowing the patient, and the three P's. Three P's is prediction of the disease, protection from infectious complications, and prevention. Third P is prevention from side effects of the drug. So when you say monitoring, what happens is when you know the patient has got diagnosis of IBD, and we kind of document. We got a dedicated IBD diary patients carry across, which includes all the information about the patient, like what is their diagnosis, and what kind of medication they're exposed to before, which part of the intestine got affected, and what about their skin health, what about their bone health, what are the blood tests are happening, and there are charts given in the booklet where the documentation happens on a regular basis. So once the patient is known to the doctor very well, our team, 2-3 of us mainly, and we come out with a plan for each patient. So how do we plan? That starts with the first P. First P is prediction. So not every IBD patient behaves in the same way. If you leave, for example, if you got 10 patients of IBD, if you leave them in a room, 10 of them, if you come back to them in 10 years time, everybody would have developed different complications. So why somebody may be perfectly fine without any complication. Other patient may develop stricture, other patient may develop perforation. Why this happens? Because each individual has got different progression of the disease. So how do we predict it? There are certain scientifically proven predictive tools. For example, if a young female is suffering from Crohn's disease who requires high dose of steroids at the time of diagnosis, that's a high risk factor. Another patient who's got perianal fistula is a high risk factor. Any smoker can be a high risk factor. Any patient with requiring high dose of steroids to push into remission can be a risk factor. So compare this kind of group of patients to somebody, an elderly male for example, is a low risk patient. So a young female and an elderly male, they behave differently when it comes to disease pattern. So the chance of complications happening are higher if you got risk factors. So at the time of diagnosis itself, and we in our unit, we make a mental map saying that, okay, if you leave this patient without aggressive treatment, in 5 years, 10 years down the line, this patient is going to develop severe complications. So based on the prediction, we adjust the treatment. So that is the first P of predictive model, right? And then second P is protection. So all IBD patients are at risk of developing opportunistic infections. Opportunistic infection means an infection which can happen in an IBD patient that normally may not happen. Why does it happen? Because of the imbalance in immunity. Why does the imbalance in immunity happens? Because IBD is a disease of immunity, number one, and many of the medications which are used for IBD treatment can suppress the immunity. So in a journey of the patient is exposed to flu, pneumonia, and now COVID and lots of other infections, chickenpox and all these things. So in a patient journey, if you just leave them alone, can develop all these opportunistic infections. So again, in the second model, what we do is we chart patient's immunity. Called immune mapping. What is the hepatitis B status of the patient? What is the hepatitis C status of the patient? Whether patient had HIV at any point, patient had chickenpox immunity or not, patient had vaccinations as a childhood, MMR vaccine or other vaccines. If these are not done, in our unit, we vaccinate these patients first, so that we are preparing for a long ride. When you go for a 24-hour journey or 36-hour journey, you pack your things well, right? In a similar way, when you're starting journey with IBD, you have to plan your journey very well. So you have to plan, anticipate any complications, and vaccinate the patient so that we are ready to face any complication in terms of infections. So that is protection from infection. The third thing, coming to your point of monitoring. So we prevent any complications happening because of the disease and complications happening because of the medication. A lot of medication can cause lots of complications. In addition to the disease itself can cause complications like osteoporosis or skin problems, liver problems, and all this cancer development. So these complications can happen because of the disease. So we plan, the monitoring depends on the risk of the patient, what kind of complication the patient can run into, whether the patient needs monthly monitoring, 3 monthly monitoring, 6 monthly monitoring. It's not same for everyone. 1 yearly monitoring. So based on that, we advise investigations and monitoring.
As you said about the side effects, in fact, whenever we take medicines also, that also has a lot of side effects. So how should we prepare mentally as a patient?
Side effects of the medicines, you mean?
Yeah, means if we take a medicine like a immunosuppressant, we
Correct.
also have to deal with a lot of issues. So how should we be prepared mentally? That should we be aware of what are the side effects of the medicines? That if I put it in a correct way.
Sure. I mean, acceptance and honesty is the key in IBD management. That means awareness starts with awareness. When you're taking medication, it's easy to think that I will be safe with the medication, I won't run into complications, you will be blinded. So we don't want to know about side effects and all. That is not the correct strategy in IBD. So one has to be aware of all the possible complications, awareness, and if the complications happen, you have to accept them, because this is nature of the game. We have to accept, we have to report to the doctor in the right time. Okay, this is very, very important. And if you don't want to know about the complications, what happens when you develop complication, you think doctor has given you wrong medication. But to be frank with you, only few options are available for us to deal with IBD. So one has to be aware of various complications and anticipate them. Unfortunately, if you end up in complication, your doctors are there to support you and report to the doctor in time so that the complication can be diagnosed and treated without much of a delay.
So I understand that. Now, as you said that it can run into complications. So what kind of symptoms can a IBD patient have that can land him or her in emergency and critical care?
Okay. Again, a very practical question, Suparna. So if you think about that, there are complications because of the disease. There are complications because of the medication. Okay. So let's start with the complications of the disease. So ulcerative colitis can run into what we call acute severe colitis or acute fulminant colitis. So that means patient can suddenly become toxic, means the temperature can shoot up, pulse rate can shoot up, tummy becomes very, very painful, and you'll be passing motion 10, 20 times with blood in that. All this can happen. So that is called maybe fulminant or acute severe flare-up of ulcerative colitis. That patient requires immediate hospital admission and immediate tackling by health of surgeons and physicians together, and IV antibiotics, lots of other medication. And Crohn's disease patient can land into complication in terms of obstruction. The small intestine can get blocked, can result in vomiting, can result in perforation, and sometimes can be life-threatening illness if the perforation happens. Other complications because of the disease, colitis, ulcerative colitis can sometimes affect the liver. The liver can get inflamed and is a condition called PSC, primary sclerosing cholangitis. Some of my patients, you might recollect that I sometimes ask for ultrasound abdomen and MRI of the liver. Why do I ask that? Because if there is any suspicion of primary sclerosing cholangitis, the liver is getting affected, that can be diagnosed by MRI scan. Okay, that is the reason we ask for it. And other complications like bone complications and other complications I already mentioned. Coming to complications because of the medication. If you plan properly, if you monitor properly, to be honest, many of the medications are wonderful. There are side effects, of course, but many can be detected, anticipated early and dealt with properly. And touch wood, not many of my patients landed up in trouble with any of the complications because we do very thorough workup in our unit and we don't compromise and on any of the workup. And myself and my colleague Dr. Sharda and my other colleague Dr. Santosh, we all meticulously work up all the patients and then anticipate, educate the patient. Starting with the 5-ASA compounds. So some of you might be taking Mesacol or Vegazodi or Coolgut or lots of other Pentasa. So all these medications are baseline medication. They are called 5-ASA compounds. They are more or less very safe medication, and sometimes they can cause intolerance, nausea, vomiting, that kind of symptoms. Sometimes they can cause little kidney damage. That can also happen, and but by and large very safe. Next medication is immunomodulation. Next medication that includes azathioprine, methotrexate, and tacrolimus, and all these things. So again, azathioprine is a wonderful drug, and but rarely it can cause lowering of white cell count. It can cause pancreatitis. It can cause nausea, headache, loss of hair. All these things can happen. And methotrexate can sometimes cause liver damage. And tacrolimus, that also can cause sometimes liver damage or kidney damage. Coming to biologics. Biologics are wonderful medication if you plan and execute properly. And they can also suppress the immunity. So there is always a chance of opportunistic infections, especially activation of tuberculosis. Biologics can cause flare-up of tuberculosis, so but that can be dealt with. And viral infections. All this can be a complication of the medication. And there are lots of newer medication there, but yet to be seen the side effects and other areas.
Doctor, like which is better, surgery or should we wait till biologics fail?
Okay, so again, very practical question. So let's talk about ulcerative colitis and Crohn's separately. Surgery can be a curative option for ulcerative colitis. Okay, because ulcerative colitis affects only large intestine. If you remove the large intestine, that is cured because there is no place for ulcerative colitis to come. If you remove large intestine, there are two options. One, patient can end up with small intestine coming out in a form of a bag where the motion can be collected, which can be taken as stigma or an embarrassment for many of the patients, which need not be, but that's how we feel, right? It's naturally understandable. And the second type of surgery is called IPA, where the small intestine is made like a pouch and stitched to the bottom. And that IPA, ileal pouch anal anastomosis.
Okay.
And so where small intestine is converted into a pouch and that going to be stitched to the rectum, where the motions can be passed in the natural way. But that also has its own plus and minus. But when should we go for surgery in ulcerative colitis? There are certain conditions. For example, if the ulcerative colitis involves only cecum, for example, only large intestine, only one part of the large intestine. Potentially people ask, can I remove that part so that it is cured? The answer is no, because if you go that road, the rest of the large intestine is still there. So disease can still come back in the rest of the large intestine. So that is not an option for ulcerative colitis. In ulcerative colitis, the surgery option is only if all the types of treatment fail or patients end up in fulminant colitis, means intestine becomes completely ballooned out, completely swollen and leads to complication or perforation happens or cancer develops. So these are the conditions where patients should go for complete colectomy, means removal of the large intestine in total, and that can be curative for ulcerative colitis. Now the problem is completely different when it comes to Crohn's disease. Crohn's disease can affect any part of the digestive tract, and if you have a part of the small intestine affected with the Crohn's disease, you can go for surgery removing that part, but only if that part is causing complication in terms of obstruction or perforation. Otherwise, no role for surgery again in Crohn's. Why? The same logic. If you have small intestine, 10 centimeters of the small intestine is affected. If you remove surgically the 10 centimeters, rest of the 5 meters of the small intestine or the large intestine can get affected with the Crohn's again. So despite undergoing surgery, you're not getting a cure. So in Crohn's, it is only if any complication happens. In ulcerative colitis, only if the medication fail or fulminant colitis happen or perforation happens or cancer develops. So in other words, we have to try medically in both the conditions in optimum way. If still not getting anywhere, then go for surgery.
It's not possible, right? Like if you see, we can remove the whole large intestine, but we cannot remove the whole small intestine in the...
No, if you remove all small intestine, there is no place for absorption, digestion, and that is, forget about whole small intestine. If you remove 1 meter of the 6 meters small intestine usually, and some people will have a shorter line, and if you remove 1 to 2 meters, people end up with what you call short bowel syndrome. Means the length of the small bowel is shortened, the absorption will go down, patients end up with a lot of diarrhea and a lot of malabsorption. The nutrients will not get absorbed, and all these issues will come up. So if complete small intestine is removed, there is no way we can survive with oral enteral nutrition. These patients would require what we call a permanent total parenteral nutrition, where the nutrition goes into the vein.
So as the medicines we see like Pentasa, it's quite costly and biologics are more costlier. So how can we reduce that?
That's a fantastic question, Suparna, because I'll put the question in another way around. So instead of thinking how do we reduce the cost of Pentasa or how do we reduce the cost of biologics, we all should be thinking how should we reduce the cost of patient care in total, right? In total. So that means there are lots of steps involved in that. I'll come to your questions as well, but lots of steps involved. This starts with the early diagnosis. If the diagnosis is delayed for a couple of years, imagine the loss of earnings, loss of suffering, multiple tests unnecessarily, and multiple antibiotics, unnecessary treatment, that is going to increase the cost. That's number one. Number two, once the diagnosis is made, if you're not starting the patient on right treatment, as I told you, a young female is different from an elderly male. If you reverse the roles, if you start biologics for elderly male, he may land up in complications easily, where he may not be requiring biologics to start with. And young female patient who's got another, say, 60 years of, 70 years of life left, if you don't start biologics straight away, this patient is going to have suffering for next 40, 50 years. So think about the number of consultations, number of blood tests, number of CT scans, number of medication this patient is taking over 40 years of time. And instead of that, you hit the disease hard. So initially itself, you hit it hard with the appropriate biologics. Biologics are costly. I'm not saying that they are cheap. But what are you trying to do here is, you're hitting the disease hard, you're making it calmer. You're making the disease calmer so that patient is not undergoing suffering for the next 40 years. So you're saving the entire cost of this 40 years treatment to nearly half of the cost. Instead of getting flare up every month, for example, this patient who received biologics may get a flare every 6 months, every 1 year. So imagine the quality of life will be better. The cost effectiveness of the treatment will be better because you hit the disease very hard initially. You made it a calm disease instead of waiting for the disease to become aggressive. Okay, and biologics are shown to reduce the number of hospital admissions. Imagine one time a patient admits, getting admitted to a hospital with a complication. The bill, if you are admitting to private hospitals nowadays, and even doctors are helpless because all the hospitals are managed by management. And each admission, you can't pay less than 1 lakh. So if you stay in the hospital for 2-3 days, that's it. So the bill goes to 70,000, 1 lakh, and all. We also feel very bad about it. But hands are tied, so we can't do much about it. Whereas if you say cost of the biologics now has come down, and in India, 1 year of treatment of biologics cost would be something like 4-5 lakhs. Normal the cost is about 8 lakhs, 9 lakhs. But if you ask your doctor to put a strong recommendation, they will give you almost like 50% discount. So it will come to about 4-5 lakhs. So by spending upfront investment, it's not a cost investment, you're reducing the complications that are going to happen in the next 20, 30 years or 40 years, and you're improving your quality of life, right, and decreasing suffering. There are a lot of research shown that appropriate use of azathioprine, biologics and other things can reduce complications, including hospital admission, perforation, surgeries. Imagine undergoing one surgery. One surgery would cost you 3-4 lakhs easily, right? Whereas you're talking about biologics cost of 4 lakhs, 5 lakhs in the entire year, which can potentially prevent 10 surgeries for you in the future. So this is a cost-effective model. That's one way. The other thing is, there is always a cheaper friend. The azathioprine is a wonderful medication. A lot of my patients are on azathioprine. Only thing is, you need to monitor your counts closely. You need to monitor your complications closely. It's very cheap drug. It's just a normal price for whatever. I don't remember the price. It's a priceless almost. Okay, so very cheap drug, and if you do appropriate counseling, appropriate monitoring, there are a lot of patients who don't land up in any complication with azathioprine. That's a wonderful cheap friend of biologics. Okay. The fourth point is, once a patient goes on to biologics or azathioprine, you need to know when to stop them. Okay, because you are well and the medications are helping, you just don't keep on continuing the medication. What happens when to stop the medication? When you go into clinical remission, means you are feeling well and intestinal ulcers are completely healed. That is called clinical remission and mucosal healing. When the mucosal healing happens, then you can continue the medication for 1 more year and then stop the medication. What happens in normal, a lot of the times, a lot of specialists also, we continue the treatment without assessing mucosal healing, and because of assessing colonoscopy and other things. So by not doing that, you are unnecessarily continuing the medication. Though the cost of medication is cheaper, the patient is taking on a long-term basis and spending blood test cost, and then may end up in pancreatitis and other complications also. So we also need to know when to stop the medication at the right time. So when to diagnose, how quickly we diagnose, how effectively we treat, choosing the right agent for right patient, choosing biologic or choosing azathioprine, monitoring correctly without ending up in complications, and stopping the medication at the right time. All these 4 factors will reduce the cost of IBD care in India. And if you ask me directly, how do you reduce the cost of biologics? Well, that is no one's hands. The pharma companies, as the more and more competitors come up, the cost will keep going down. But I emphasize on cutting the cost of the care. The total care cost can be cut down. There is again a lot of studies published how to make the best out of your IBD treatment in a cost-effective way. Though it may be initially sounding expensive, the overall cost, if you look at 20 years journey, it will be much cheaper.
Like as you said about the clinical remission, can you just see what is exactly clinical remission? Do patients' symptoms still there in clinical remission even if the results show that it is not there, the disease is suppressed?
Yeah, so there are 2 terms used. One is the response, second is the remission. Response is anybody who's got symptoms, if they get some 30-40% reduction in their symptoms, that is called response. Remission is complete absence of symptoms. So when you start the treatment, patient may get some partially better, then you are calling patient responded to treatment but not completely into remission, right? When the symptoms completely gone, then you are talking about complete remission. That is called clinical remission. Sometimes mucosal healing, that's when you do colonoscopy and all, mucosa will be completely healed. That is called mucosal healing or endoscopic remission.
Okay. So doctor, what are the recent researches about the disease and its treatment?
There are a lot of new molecules being tried on the trial phase now. There are a lot of clinical trials going on, something like filgotinib, and lots of other new molecules are being tried. They are in the clinical trial phase. And we also are having a clinical trial called filgotinib trial in our unit. And there is a newer agent which came up in the Indian market called vedolizumab, which is a biologic vedolizumab. Previous to that, we had two biologics. One is infliximab, second is adalimumab. The newer agent is called vedolizumab. The uniqueness of this agent is it is gut selective, means gut specific. Infliximab and adalimumab affects the whole body, but the vedolizumab acts on only the large intestine or small intestine, and it's a gut selective biologic. So it doesn't affect other parts of the body. In a way, this is much safer and little more effective. But having said that, not everyone may be suitable for vedolizumab. Some people may be better off with infliximab or adalimumab. Some people are better with, depending on the patient profile and other things. For example, fistulas, vedolizumab may not be the best agent. Infliximab may be the better agent. So it depends. But overall, that's a newer agent which come up in the market.
As it is seen that IBD is generally started at a younger age, so why it is still not, in India, it is still not considered as a disability?
Yeah, that's a big political question, I think. So, if you look at what do you call that act, Rights of Person with Disabilities, RPWD Act, which is come up in 2015-16. That list of conditions which are categorized as disabilities, like for example, learning disabilities, leprosy, heel leprosy, and dwarfism, and some neurological conditions. All these are labeled as disabilities. So there are government. What has happened is with the Parliament Act in that year, the rights of persons with disabilities give some rights to person with disabilities. For example, people may get some reservation quota in institutes and in the jobs if you got disability certificate, and there are some allowances may be there. So it has to be politically driven, and then government should realize that people with IBD are long-term sufferers. When you say some chronic neurological conditions, why not IBD? Yes, IBD can also be, should also be seriously considered, because this is one condition which can greatly impact your quality of life, your earning potential, your working potential, and you end up in complications and other things. So there are a lot of sufferers. It needs a bigger momentum across the country, and then political pressure to say that IBD should be included in the Disability Act.
Also, do you think it is fair to permanently exclude IBD from insurances?
Well, I'm not aware it's permanently excluded from insurance companies, but if it is, that's very, very unfair. What I keep telling my patients, I personally never inquired on the insurance side, but I keep telling my patients that you take insurance, you declare the condition. You declare the condition. Usually the inclusion criteria, most of the companies say you can't cover for the existing conditions for 2 years or something, 1-2 years or so. But at least after 2 years you get covered if you get into some kind of complication. But are you saying it's completely excluded from all the insurance? I'm not aware of that.
Yeah, it is.
Right, we need to check with them. Yeah, I think it is included if you declare, and then after a certain number of years it can be included, but I need to check on that.
So, Doctor, what are your suggestions for patient advocates like us to bring under the coverage?
As I said, you are doing a wonderful job. You and your friends, group of young, you call it young individuals, who are fighting for rights of IBD patients, and you should be increasing awareness among population and bring some momentum. Meet the representative, government representative. I know it's very, very hard to get anything done from government sector, but at least fight for some kind of allowances, some kind of benefits, and disability allowance if it is fantastic, and then increase awareness and connect the right patients to right doctors, and then create a network. Create network where there can be patient advocates, patient IBD specialists, IBD nurses, dietitians, and then all can be kind of working together to improve quality of life for IBD patients. Anything from my side, I'm more than happy to do.
Yeah, obviously, we need always your help and suggestions.
Yeah.
So, these are the, and how quickly and what are the easier steps to create awareness? Means there are so many factors as you said. So, any specific points that you would like to highlight first that you should cover?
I mean, nowadays the best way to reach people out is social media. So social media campaigns, Facebook, Twitter, dedicated IBD groups, and say in Western countries there are a lot of IBD groups, officially and unofficially. Officially, the country has come out with organization like Crohn's and Colitis Foundation. Of course, in India also there is Crohn's and Colitis Foundation of India, and in USA there is an official organization. But there are a lot of patient groups which are lacking in India. So you can create a network of people. You can exchange ideas and exchange treatment ideas, exchange some sufferings, and just be open. Don't feel shy or whatever. Just exchange your thoughts, share your difficulties. And as a part of that, we created Innovate IBD Group, which is including only, of course, our patients. And we come across a lot of regular discussion among our IBD patients. They exchange ideas between them, and then for mutual benefit. That way, you should be progressing.
Great job, doctor. It really helps patients like us when doctors themselves take the initiative and discuss that. So let's see if we can get some questions. Is there any questions that people have? Nikhil?
Yeah, Dr. Kiran, I'd like to ask
Hi,
a
Nikhil.
question.
Yeah, please, Nikhil.
Yeah, so is there any like about pain in IBD? So many people suffer a lot of pain in IBD that's not directly connected to like intestine, like in the back area, or sometimes neuropathic pain. So but doctors are not able to, like, not all doctors, like some patients have had very like bad experiences with that. So why do you think that is the problem
Yeah.
of pain management in IBD?
Correct. It's a very difficult area even for doctors, the pain management in IBD, because many a time we won't be able to diagnose for sure why this patient is getting pain. Is it because of intestinal inflammation? Is it because of bone pain, which is the nerve pain you were mentioning about? Or is it because of any further complication like pancreatitis pain or any other pain? So getting to the bottom of it, the first thing. The second point is, so even if you diagnose the pain as a correct originating from bone or intestine or whatever, most of the painkillers, what we normally use for muscle pains and all, they can actually aggravate IBD activity, right? Say for example, ibuprofen, diclofenac and all these things, they're excellent for muscle pains and bone pains, but they should not be used very much in IBD because that can cause flare-up of the disease. There are second group of painkillers called opioid analgesics, like tramadol, for example, Ultracet and other things. These medication, again, if you use in excess, they can cause constipation. And if a patient with a stricturing disease, in Crohn's disease, if they go into constipation, that can cause blockage. So that is also a problem. So number one, diagnosing right way is a challenge. Number two, even after diagnosis, managing, we don't have many choices, many drugs available to treat this patient with pain. So unfortunately, that is the case. The easier situation is if the pain is because of the poorly controlled disease, like intestinal pain coming from poorly control of the disease, then it's easy affair because we can escalate the treatment of IBD that itself should control the pain.
Thank you.
Doctor, last question from my side. Is there any connection between menstruation in women and IBD? Because personally, I have some friends, and me myself also, I really suffer and my symptoms really go up during the period time.
Yeah, that is also a debatable topic because the hormonal changes what happen, and there is supposed to be some intestinal sensitivity which can be aggravated because of the hormonal sensitivity, hormonal fluctuations. And there is no direct relation of menstrual cycle with the IBD, but again, because the hormonal changes and intestinal sensitivity can go up and down, and that can cause trouble sometimes.
In such cases, is it better to work with a gynecologist and do hormonal treatments if possible? And does it really affect Crohn's if as a woman we can do that?
Sorry, you repeated again?
If we do some hormonal treatment, does it affect our Crohn's? Does it aggravate or reduce?
No, it should not affect Crohn's or it should not affect IBD. If the pain or if it is related to some hormonal imbalance, then we can safely go for hormonal treatment and then that should not affect IBD in any way.
We would like to end here, and really thank you so much, Doctor.
I will give one more message before we close. And with regards to IBD treatment, there are not many options available. We have to play around with the options available. And if you are really pushed to the corner, don't be hesitant to go on the clinical trials, because a lot of people, when I say clinical trials, people get worried because it's an experimental drug and other thing. It's really not like that. Before anybody goes into clinical trial, any drug comes into trial stage, it undergoes robust testing, animal models, healthy volunteers, and other things. And all the medication, including paracetamol, would have come up in the trial phase only initially, right? So be bold. If you're really pushed to a corner, if you don't have a choice, if you're really struggling, you can't afford biologics, don't suffer. Just go with the clinical trial. Most of the clinical trials have good outcomes, so not to get worried. And there are robust systems in place to monitor these patients, to report to any side effects and other things. Because if you don't opt for clinical trials, what have you got? You can't afford biologics and other things, you will be suffering. And 10-20 years down the line, the suffering is only going to increase. You end up in complications. So be bold in taking up the trials if required.
Dr. Kiran, so where do we get the information about these trials? Because like I'm hearing about this for the first time in my IBD journey, that we can do this.
Yeah, that's a very good point again. And this is one thing which I discussed with some of the clinical research coordinators. And in fact, one of my friend who is working on the trial side is not a gastroenterologist, but he works for clinical research organizations. So I told him an idea that we should really conduct sessions on clinical trials, the awareness of what happens in clinical trial. Probably you can plan one session with him too or whatever. So that awareness of clinical trials should be increased among patients. And so even say, for example, the biologics, infliximab, all came through clinical trials. Of course, there are trials which failed. There are patients who had complications, not to worry about them, because the only other option you got is suffering, which I would not encourage at all, and you land up in complications more often than taking up the clinical trial. Clinical trials are designed robustly. They have a treatment arm, they have a placebo arm, right? Placebo arm is where you get a dummy drug. You may not get the actual drug, but at some point in the treatment cycle, you end up into the actual drug required.
And lastly, does this IBD affect the lifespan of patients? This is also a very...
it affects the quality of life more often, and I have not seen, or put to other way, rarely people can get into life-threatening complications such as perforation and thromboembolic events. That's one thing which I did not cover in my talk, which means people with IBD, they're at risk of developing clots in the legs like DVT, clots in the lungs, especially when you have a flare-up. Okay, that should be borne in mind, and then adequate prophylaxis we often give, like anticoagulations and other things. So,
can be for any age. This clotting can develop at any age or at older ages.
Any age with activity of the disease. People with IBD activity are at a risk of developing clot and thromboembolic complications. Not everyone, but there is always a small increased risk.
The session today. Thank you so much for having us with you, and thank you so much for helping us with so much of information.
Thanks, Suparna and Nikhil. Thanks all the team, and you've taken a wonderful initiative. I congratulate and wish you all the best in your trial with creating an NGO and helping all the IBD patients.
Thank you so much.
So
Bye-bye.
I'll just end it.
Bye.